Yeah, so we have an opportunity here to have another time of sharing from Father Ezra Sullivan. He's going to take us through some of his writing that you should all have received beforehand. Father Ezra is a Dominican friar. He's also an author. He wrote Heroic Habits for Discovering the Soul's Potential for Greatness, which I think you all have mentioned, the idea of this idea of purpose and meaning, thinking about something bigger than ourselves. So it's just such a perfect person to come and share with us. He's had great thoughts to share in past Humanity 2.0 forums, so I'm excited to hear him again. And we'll have a time of question and answer after that as well. So Father Ezra, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, I would like to begin by thanking the invitation from Matthew, Ron, Father Luray, and all of the participants. This is very exciting, and there's so much to discuss. We'll just have to continue our conversations later. I'm really happy that we're starting with confusion. It's an important place to be in which we ask ourselves, what are the deepest questions, and how do we go about answering them? In this talk, I'm going to begin by hopefully confusing you more, and then leading us perhaps out of that confusion to some clarity and also some, well, controversial statements. And then we'll see where we land. So you received the paper, which was a draft from a collaboration that I performed with Matthew, and we had a number of scholars from around the world who worked on the question, what is human flourishing? How do we understand the biggest obstacles that are facing humanity? Of course, none of us could predict that one of the biggest obstacles to human flourishing was right around the corner and would be 2 years in the making. And so finally, here we are back again to re-ask the most fundamental question. Because as Matthew said, if we don't know what human flourishing is, well, it'll be hard to get there. So let's begin with why. Why do we need a human flourishing framework? How is this useful? I'd like to start with a very interesting study that was done by Matt Roser. And essentially, Max, he went and asked 2 questions of people. The first one was, how happy are you? And then, of course, you can grade that on a scale: not happy, somewhat happy, rather happy, or very happy. He asked a second question, and he said, what percentage of people do you think said that, all things taken together, they are very happy or rather happy? So in other words, how happy are you? How happy do you think your neighbor will report being? And the results were astonishingly diverse. Essentially, what they found is that in every country, people think that others are less happy than they themselves say. So for instance, in Hungary, it's one of the greatest disparities. Nearly 70% of people reported themselves being very happy. But they predicted that only about 20% of their neighbors would report being very happy. Similarly, South Korea, 90% of people said they're very happy, but they thought that probably only 20% of their neighbors would predict the same result. In the US, well, slightly different. 90% of the United States, they said they're very happy, but they thought only 50% of their neighbors were going to be the same way. What does this mean? If the numbers are strictly accurate, it could indicate that people who take polls are happier than people who don't. But probably the numbers mean something else. People perhaps are less happy than they report. Perhaps they project their own negative feelings onto their neighbors. But that raises the question, why not report accurately? There's another possibility. People are generally happier than they seem. When you look at your neighbor, they're happier than they seem to you. But both of this raises the question as to either why is reporting inaccurate, or why do people seem less happy than they actually are? One reason I suggest is related to issues of trying to define issues such as development, happiness, well-being. I was very pleased with Laura's contribution in trying to emphasize the importance that these small phrases of definitions can have on our way of organizing our life. And one example of this is the Human Development Index, also utilized by the same researcher, Max Roser. And in there, he says that human development can be measured by three things: a long and healthy life, measured by life expectancy; access to education, measured by years of schooling; and a decent standard of living, measured by gross national income per capita. Sounds reasonable. I think we all want life, education, and a higher standard of living. But of course, within this framework, part of the question becomes, well, are people truly developing? And the answer is yes, they are. So the Human Development Index shows us over time, basically every country in the world, according to these three measurables, are increasing. That sounds good. It is good. Is that enough? What do we find? Well, we find that people report being happier and developing, but there's a decline in friendship. Well, maybe friendship isn't related to development. Maybe friendship is only slightly related to being happy. If you look at the results up there, we see in 1990, about 4% of men reported having no friend or one friend. And that increased in 2021 to about 21% of men. In 1990, 7% of women reported having no friend or one friend, and it increased in 2021 to 18%. So there's a decline in friendship, but there's an increase in development. Should we conclude that development or even happiness has little to do with lack of friends? Well, here's another statistic to notice. People are lonelier at school. We were talking with Katie about her work in trying to help people to have love and inquiry in their school and to have this way of relating to others in a deeper, meaningful way. Well, it's interesting that just as these projects are happening, people are feeling lonelier everywhere. English-speaking countries the most, Latin America, Europe, East Asia. There's a common trend. How does this relate to development, well-being, and happiness? Well, it's interesting because we notice that we now have one of the largest studies of mental health and loneliness that's ever been conducted, because 33 published papers showed that surveying about 132 people found that the lockdowns increased mental illness 2 times, depression 4.5 times, stress 1.5 times, loneliness. Could we have predicted this? Well, if we'd been on Zoom, I think we all are. It's interesting because what it shows is that despite the ability to connect with one another through the internet, that there's still something perhaps missing. Could we have been able to predict that this might have happened? That isolation from each other could cause depression and even mental illness? Yes, we could have been able to predict it. In surveys around the world, people report that family is the #1 thing that gives meaning to their lives. The second thing they say is occupation. But as Matt showed, occupation is often unsatisfying. So if people report that it gives meaning, but occupation is unsatisfying, there's a big problem. And then the third, health and occupation, or health, is what gives most meaning to people in their lives. So we should have been able to predict that lack of friends, increased loneliness and isolation is going to lead to problems. Distance from family, it's going to lead to mental illness, perhaps. But why didn't we see that in the first place? What's wrong with our way of looking at the world? Well, I want to recap. What we say is people are consistently reporting themselves to be happier than their neighbors are. They think their neighbors are unhappier. Friendship is declining. Human development is going up. No wonder people don't know what happiness and well-being is. I think we've forgotten at least 3 important facts. Family is a major source of meaning in life, as people will report, but often don't use as a measure in their own business practices. Friends are essential to mental health, but often they're not included in measures of well-being. And then there's the issue of what is life all about? And we've already heard something of an answer to that. But I'd like to ask, why have we forgotten these things? And I'm going to propose that one of the major reasons why we've forgotten them is because of how we understand or misunderstand the human person. If we don't understand what a human being is, we will not understand what is flourishing or well-being or any of the other elements that make up part of human life. One model of the human person that is very widespread, and by model I mean it's an implicit mental structure that people use. I'm not suggesting that there's large numbers of people saying that there are robots, among us. I think there's a small group of people who perhaps believe, we're in virtual reality. But what I mean by the robot model of the human person is it's a technocratic way of thinking. Things must be easily measurable, and they must be quantifiable. In fact, some people have called this the tyranny of quantification. How much profit are they bringing in? What's their input in terms of hours? What is their output in terms of measurable outcomes? Widgets sold, customers processed, how many calls have been made? The results of this robotic way of thinking about the human person is that the human person becomes more and more absorbed within what we can call the world machine. The French philosopher Jacques Ellul put it this way. He says that people in business and government profess to adapt the machine to man. Of course, ergonomic chairs, and we have phones that fit in our hands. He says, but such adaptation doubtlessly exists, and it leads to great improvement, but it leads to a counterpart, namely, man's nature has been modified. Man's nature is modified by the machine. And this can be for good or for ill. And think about how our natures have been modified incidentally by the technocratic world. Perhaps people have gained weight, they've lost their attention, their ability to read, their time spent, what they think is fun is all focused on these available machines. Ellul continues and says, the more human factors are taken into account in the development of technology, the more man becomes irreversibly subordinated to the machine. The more you try to make the machines human, the more man becomes machine-like. Very, very interesting. Well, the word robot, you may know, was coined in 1921 by a Czech named Karl Čapek. And robot actually means slave. The idea some people had is that a robot was a human slave. We can tell it what to do. But Čapek recognized that sometimes people can become enslaved to our technology. What an insight. And so here I bring the quotation from Martin Heidegger. He says, technology is not demonic, but its essence is mysterious. The essence of technology as a destining of revealing is the danger. And what he means is that when we look at the machine, it's going to destine the way we think about other people. In fact, the more that we make machines that are human-like, the more we will think of other people not as flesh and blood, but as gears and gadgets and a program to be inserted into them by business or by government or by some larger superstructure. That's how machines operate, and we start to think that's how we can make others operate as well. Now, of course, there's another way of looking at the human being, aside from the robotic, technocratic way, and this is to see us as animals. We might say that this is the counterpart to the technocratic way of life, because as advances in technology were becoming more apparent, as seen with the development of railroads, the electric light, the typewriter in the 1800s, the Romantic movement arose. The Romantics were, well, just as the word says, romantic. They're artists, poets, composers, writers. They emphasize the individual, the subjective, the irrational, the imagination, love, emotion. The French poet Charles Baudelaire, if you want to read some interesting poetry, take a look at that. But he wandered the streets of Paris experimenting with drugs and prostitutes, and he said, Romanticism is situated neither in the subject of truth, but in the way of feeling. Perhaps a great example of this way of understanding the human person simply as an animal with passions and feelings and blood and guts, but maybe the mind starts to somewhat be subordinated to them, is the poet Lord Byron. A famous sentence of his was, "Eat, drink, and love, because the rest is not worth a nickel." He says that man is in part divine, but a troubled stream from a pure source. He, of course, traveled the world. He womanized a number of people, and he joined the Greek War of Independence. He died at 36 as a folk hero while fathering many children out of wedlock and leaving a great emotional wave of pain in his wake. Influences from the animal view of man might include back to nature hippies, romantic movies, the sidelining of rational analysis, drug culture, limitless sexual hedonism, and consumer culture. This reductionistic way of seeing the human person finds a critique in St. Augustine. He says, even in the body, though it dies like the beasts and is in many ways weaker than theirs, what greatness, what goodness of God, what providence of the Creator is apparent. And that's why I was very pleased to hear Father Bob talk about man made in the image of God, that we have this way of manifesting the higher transcendent life of God in our very selves. So how does this relate to flourishing? Well, I'm going to propose that neither the robotic, technocratic, nor the animalistic views of the human person are adequate. They both have something true in them, but they're not complete. Instead, I think we should think about trees. And this might be surprising because vegetables are so different from most of us, but the tree actually is more useful as an analogy, precisely because it helps us to see that life is the fundamental element in our human person. And once again, Father Bob and I did not share notes, but this emphasis on the interior dynamic force that we have called life that expands itself through our thoughts and emotions, through our actions and relations, helps us to see that without an understanding of the biological life connected with the rational life, we cannot truly understand what the human is or human flourishing. And of course, this is also scriptural. The Psalms express it this way: the just shall flourish like the palm tree. They shall grow like a cedar of Lebanon. They shall bear fruit even in old age, always vigorous and sturdy. What a lovely thought. Let's get more specific. What is flourishing? Well, the etymology tells us that it comes from the Latin word florere, which means to bloom, to blossom, to flower. And then this comes from the Latin flos, a flower. So literally, when something is flourishing, it's the act of bearing flowers, which is directed teleologically to the bearing of fruit. We know that when a tree flowers, it's getting ready to bear whatever fruit it will have, whether it's going to be apples or cherries or oranges, that the flower is the first part of this final process, which in the end is related to sharing and giving life. So when we speak about flourishing, well, analogously, how does that relate to the human being? Aristotle already mentioned, I think 3 times, maybe 4. He says flourishing is this excellent activity of humans in accordance with their rational nature. So it's holistic. It's biological, but it's also something spiritual. And this is where this framework comes to play. Here's the large framework, and I'll break it up in order to describe it in more detail. But one of the things that we did, the team that we had, and we had psychologists and philosophers, we had medical doctors, and others from lots of different fields helped to contribute to what this became. And what we noticed is that, first of all, we have, so if you notice on what we're looking at the left-hand side, we see the individual good part of the pyramid, and it has different levels or layers. Part of the understanding of this is the objective measure. And there are some things that come first, often chronologically, but in a way are objectively the things necessary for the next step to exist. Go into more detail. Physiological needs: food, water, safety. And then we have, once those are available, this is why many NGOs focus on that bottom level, because if you don't have world peace, if you don't have safety, then the other levels of psychological well-being often are less present. It's more difficult, at least, to achieve them. Making and doing needs: play. I have not heard anybody talk about play in terms of flourishing. But I tell you what, if you don't have play, you will not have a happy child. All work and no play, well, we know this the saying. But after that, psychological needs: feeling good, and we went into that in some great detail. And then finally, intellectual needs, which is not always equated to feeling good. Now, these are individuals, but common good has a parallel and complementary aspect. So you see, going from the bottom up, local and world peace relates to the individual safety, but now we're doing it in common as a community. Above that, we have commerce, entertainment, and art. I was just speaking with, during the break, someone who runs an art gallery in New York City. And the fact is that art is essential to human life. Even aside from the aesthetics of architecture and feng shui, we can say that having people express their own interior life in a beautiful way is such an important element. And once again, I've always been amazed why this is missing from, academics who perhaps have less encounters with art. It's too bad. Above that, we have psychological health, and then organizations that help us achieve that, and then finally schools and universities. Father Ezra, isn't that all we need? Isn't that just enough? It's not. We have communal flourishing as well. And here we're rising through it. We have political needs. I'm always amazed when people, once again, omit things like politics. I know it's unpleasant, but we need it. If we don't have healthy politics, we're not going to have safety, water. This is something that should be rather apparent. But I think above that is community needs. And this is what people showed in the survey that I showed. Consistently throughout the world, people rate family as the number one element that gives their life meaning. And so that's why I put it near the top of the pyramid, because people will admit that to themselves, but it's harder to admit that when you're working for government or for business. Because how do you help people in their individual lives connect with their families? How as a business are you going to make this priority that people have a realizable factor in your own business model? Very, very important, but hard to achieve. Notice also we have free associations there on the right-hand side, the common good side. There's a famous book called Bowling Alone, and or something like that. And it basically describes this phenomenon in the United States where, when the book was written in the early 2000s, it pointed out that the number of people bowling was the same, but they were no longer bowling in clubs. People would go as individuals or couples. And this is a very interesting thing, because in the not too recent past, people would say that free association is an element necessary for healthy society. It helps to tamp down certain practices of businesses or governments, and it helps also people to have something in common aside from profitability and political engagement. Very important to have these, like artist communes or co-ops. Okay, now above this though, we have to say that above all of that is spiritual flourishing. And this is purposely untaught, because it turns out that for some people, if they have that top part of the triangle, some of the other parts can actually disappear. It's very interesting how the pyramid works, because I think we're all familiar with, I thought the example of the fellow who lost his ability to walk. I thought that was a great example, because it shows that sometimes if we don't have physiological flourishing, but we have higher levels, we can still achieve that sense of psychological well-being in connection with others. And likewise, there are some people who have had spiritual flourishing, and yet they were in absolutely terrible conditions, physiologically or even communally. Maybe they were outcasts. Maybe they were persecuted for their religion. Maybe they were misunderstood. And yet they still found meaning because of that higher level. And so how to achieve that within a business context is a rather difficult, or it's not clear that's even possible. But I would say within communal life, this is an essential factor. Now, people who have studied psychology will be immediately aware that our human flourishing framework has a lot in common with Maslow. And I'm not going to walk through Abraham Maslow's one model that he provided, but I'll just note that in his later studies, he also pointed out that our human happiness or our needs aren't simply individualistic, but he left room for self-transcendence. But we'll just notice that this sort of hierarchy is, I would argue that it's less objectively clear, and also it's not integrated with society as well as ours is. And so we took account of this, and this is actually extremely powerful because Maslow, his own hierarchy of needs, is utilized both in psychological studies even now, as well as in businesses. So we're proposing this one as a developed and more nuanced and both empirically verifiable version. One of the things that I think is worthwhile to consider about this model of human flourishing is going back to what Julian described in this concern about our environment. And our environment has multiple layers. There's the man-made environment in which we live. And a lot of studies show that if you not only live in a more beautiful place, then you can be more generous, but also if you live in a place where you're more distracted, in noisy places. I live in the middle of Rome here, and we're always hearing helicopters and sirens and these seagulls, and it's harder to actually have that sense of being undistracted. So I would argue that the account that we give both of our human-made environment as well as the natural environment in which we're embedded is essential for contextualizing these larger spheres. And so I like to think of human flourishing as an ecosystem. And this also allows us to speak both about individual flourishing with your own particular characteristics and how one of us might be a palm tree and another a fern. And so this analogy is really helpful because it helps us to recognize that the flourishing actually has an integrated and yet diverse way of interacting. Somebody pointed out to me, again during the break, that we want to be sure to recognize that our understanding of flourishing is open to the input of many different cultures. And I would say this is like different ecosystems entirely. So going to what Steve Fuller was pointing out, in that there are different aesthetic ways of thinking, there are different ways of understanding flourishing of an environment. Well, the flourishing of a high-steppe desert in Kazakhstan is going to be different than the flourishing in the Amazonian region. And yet we can still say both flourish according to their own specific capacities, natures, and interests. And I think we have to say that too, that the flourishing of an army, which is absolutely necessary for defense, is going to look slightly different than the flourishing of a large business where they're in Minnesota. So we can allow for this concept of flourishing to also take into account the different ecosystems that exist. So it's quite a valuable and flexible sort of analogy that has a lot of richness. The further we go into it, the more we can draw from it in order to understand the basics for human life. Why does this matter? Well, I'll give one reason, and it's just crass. In the wake of the war in Ukraine and the ensuing human tragedy, this is a study done by McKinsey recently, Lucy Perez and her colleagues. They said that critics are arguing that the importance of the ESG has peaked. Attention, they contend, will shift increasingly to the more foundational elements of a Maslow-type hierarchy of private and public sector needs. This was published just a couple of months ago. Very interesting that people are returning to what some might think of as philosophic abstractions, but they want to go to the foundations of the universe. And this is where we can move forward. And it also has some benefits in terms of profitability. That a study done in 2011 showed that when businesses invest in well-being measures for their businesses and for the people who are part of their team, they reap a reward that is far greater than that initial investment. So that is just a simple profitability motive. But of course, we all want to flourish, and it helps us to flourish when we recognize the flourishing and encourage it in others. So part of our work then is to move forward. I hope that we can collaborate in a greater way to understand what is this thing called human flourishing, how does it relate to well-being and happiness, to have some kind of external evaluation of our own ideas. This is partly what we're doing now. To have a wider data set, not only in terms of polling people, but perhaps a qualitative data set. What do other philosophers, what do theologians say about this? Do other religions, other cultures, how do they inform us? And we want to have greater causal analysis, not just description, and finally greater scale. Thank you.